Good morning, everybody. How's it going? Welcome to another day of AP European History. All right. We'll get started in a few minutes here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for saying hello in the chat. Hello there. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in this morning. Hello. Okay, so it is 9:08, so we're going to jump right into it right now. Couple of things that I need to mention to you. Of course, the last time we had a test, and hopefully you got that done. I do know that there was one student who reached out to me about an issue. I'm going to have to investigate that one. I'm not exactly sure how that's all going to pan out, but we'll figure it out. Give me some time on those tests. I do have to grade the writing section of it, and that will take me a little bit. Particularly, I won't be able to do it today because I just have way too much else going on. Today's my busy day. Wednesdays are really, really hard days for me. So I teach basically from 7 o'clock in the morning all the way up until 9 p.m. tonight between here and the college. So I do have quite a bit of work ahead of me today already without even having to grade those tests. And so give me a couple of days on that, and I'll try and get them up as soon as I can. Hopefully by the end of the week here, they'll be up, if not early next week. So, but I think I can probably finish them up by Friday when I leave work on Friday. So that should give me plenty of time. I haven't looked at all at the test, so I don't know how anyone did on it yet or anything like that. I won't know that until I have a chance to sit down and go through all of them. So just be aware of that. And then we are also going to be starting a new unit today. So today there will be a new set of questions. There already is a new set of questions. It's already posted. I just posted it for first period. A new set of questions, 20 questions pertaining to the reading. This unit only covers one chapter, so it will probably feel like it goes a little faster, and there will be slightly less work than there was in Unit 1. Plus, we're already kind of situated in the context of history now, and we're just going to keep moving forward a little bit as we move into the early 1500s, moving into the 16th century. So we've largely covered what we need to cover for the 1400s, although I will cover a couple of things here today regarding the 13 and 1400s, a few figures that we're going to be talking about, historical figures from that era. There is also now a new PowerPoint on Canvas. So if you go to the Files section on Canvas, you will see a folder called Lecture PowerPoints, and there will be a new file up in there called Protestant Reformation or Unit 2 or something along those lines. And that is the one that we will be using today. Hopefully my administrative privileges get restored here and I will be able to start screen sharing, but for right now I still cannot. But hopefully I will be able to soon here. And, excuse me, sorry about that. It's been a busy week. So you may want to go ahead and pull that up because that is what we're going to be principally looking at today. Straighten out my monitor here a little bit. There we go. So go ahead and pull that up if you would be so kind and follow along as I start going through some of this stuff. We are moving into a brand new unit called the Protestant Reformation. This correlates with chapter 13 of your book, which there should be a reading assignment for that to go along with your questions today. Now, is there anyone in here at this point who does not have a textbook? If you do not have a textbook, please do let me know as soon as possible. Because if you don't have a textbook, it's going to be awfully hard to do the questions for the reading guide. So you kind of do need to have both of them. Both the reading guide and the textbook, that is. Well, I am not seeing anyone saying I don't have a book, so I'm going to assume that everybody does have a book at this point, which is good because it'll save me some time and I won't have to like create a PDF from all the pages of the book and stuff like that. So do use your book to get through the reading. The reading assignment is right in the, is the reading guide in the textbook. The reading guide are the questions. That's the questions that are on Canvas. That's what the reading guide is. So yeah, you just wouldn't be able to answer the questions from the reading guide without the textbook. So, and then the reading assignment is on the assignment when you click on the assignment on Canvas, you'll be able to see the reading assignment in there. All right, so go ahead and open up that Protestant Reformation PowerPoint. And this unit is going to be talking a lot in terms of Persia categories. This one is heavily religious. We're talking about a lot of religious history in Europe today. And I'll be explaining how religious divisions start to develop in what was previously a uniformly Catholic Europe. So this is Unit 2, Protestant Reformation. The picture on the the reading guide is the questions. Yeah, that's all that is. The reading guide is not. That's the questions that I'm giving you on the assignment. Okay, so the picture on this first PowerPoint slide in the background is Wittenberg Cathedral, or Wittenberg Church, and this church was a church that famously Martin Luther went up to the doors of Wittenberg Cathedral, Wittenberg Church, and nailed his 95 Theses protesting the practices of the Roman Catholic Church. All right. So what we're going to be doing here to start off this class is just talking a little bit about why the Protestant Reformation starts. And what I'd like you to be thinking about as we go through this section here is basically the idea of whenever we're talking in history about historical arguments, about making an argument, you want to make sure that you're substantiating that argument with good evidence. And so what I'm going to do for these first few slides, it's not just information that I'm presenting you. It is information, and it's good information to remember. But I want you to be thinking about how I'm presenting you the information, because when we make an argument about something, unless we back it up with specific evidence, that argument doesn't really hold weight, okay? And it makes it no better than anyone else's opinion, okay? And opinions are just based on what, do you like sushi? Do you not like sushi? That's an opinion. An argument is like, is it based in fact? Is it based in reality? And how are you supporting that argument, right? So when I'm talking to you in this first part here, I want you to be thinking about how, from a historical argumentation standpoint, I'm not only presenting you with a statement about history, but I'm also going to be substantiating that statement with a number of different pieces of evidence, more specific pieces of evidence, to help hold that argument up, to help support or substantiate that argument, okay? And so that's how these first few slides are going to go. I'm going to be talking to you about, why does the Protestant Reformation start in the first place? What are the precursors? What are the causes? What ends up precipitating in the Protestant Reformation? Now, when we think about that word Protestant, the root word of that is protest. So what are they protesting? And we have to think about some of the things that were happening with the Roman Catholic Church at this time that created enough unrest, we'll say, amongst some of the adherents to the Catholic faith to say, I'm Catholic and I value my Christian views and so on, but I just don't really I don't really see the Roman Catholic Church holding itself to the bar that it should be holding itself to. That somehow the Catholic Church has lost some moral standing, that the Catholic Church has lost some prestige, and that these reformers start to say, hey, we need to make some changes here. Okay, we need to kind of bring the church back to the way that it used to be, when it was a more holy, sanctimonious institution that held itself up to the true tenets of Christianity. Okay, so moving on to slide 2 of the PowerPoint. If you're following along with me here, I always encourage you to do that in this time where I still don't have the ability to screen share. I have it pulled up on my screen. It's the second slide is causes of the Reformation. So today I gotta lower my voice, because I'm used to talking really, really loud. Okay, projecting my voice in front of class, but I have to give like 2 more lectures today after this one. I've already given one. I have to give another lecture at 3 p.m. until 4:25, so another 90-minute lecture, and then I have to give a lecture from 6 p.m. until 9 p.m. And so I got to save my voice a little bit. So I'm gonna try and talk a little bit more quietly, because I'm used to talking extremely loud. But if I talk at the volume that I'm used to talking and projecting my voice for a class, even though there's nobody else in here but me, I'm going to lose my voice, and that'll be bad. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to talk a little quieter, if that's okay with you guys. Okay, so causes of the 14th and 15th centuries hurt the prestige, or excuse me, not causes, crises of the 14th and 15th centuries hurt the prestige of the clergy. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about some of these crises. And you're familiar with some of them. We talked last unit about this Avignon papacy. where in the 1300s there was a split in the church, a schism, okay, the Great Schism, which created essentially two main spiritual authorities, a pope and what they call an anti-pope, and each of these guys excommunicated the other and called themselves the legitimate pope, okay, the legitimate head of the Roman Catholic Church. As you can understand, this is something that's going to hurt the prestige of the church, because showing this level of division, okay, at the top ranks of the Roman Catholic Church means that these two, that the church is having problems, okay, that there's stuff going on and there's conflicts in the church. Imagine like a giant company, a really huge influential company like Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, whatever, and there was somehow a split in the company, and each owner of the company decides, I'm the rightful owner and you're not the rightful owner, and da-da-da-da-da. Now, of course, we don't see stuff like that happen these days, because there's tons of laws and legal things, that contracts and various other things that people have that are all written down. But in the church at this time, the church is way more powerful, okay, than any of those individual companies. Those companies are powerful, don't get me wrong, they're very wealthy and stuff, but the church has a stranglehold on everybody's spiritual beliefs. They have a stranglehold on the economy of Europe, on the politics of Europe. They're very, very, very ingrained into all segments of society. And so the church is in some sense, it's even more striking, right, that there would be a massive split in the church. And this hurts the prestige of the church, because it shows people, at least anyone who knew that this church split occurred, that there's problems, okay? The church is undergoing some issues at this time. Now, the church does reunite eventually, of course, but the damage has kind of been done. Afterwards, there's this thing called the Conciliar Movement, and this was an attempt to reform the church kind of from within, the church taking a look at its own institutions and saying, hey, maybe we ought to make some changes. And then ultimately they decide, no, we're not going to make any changes. So this Conciliar Movement was an attempt to reform the church and give the church council more power than the Pope, to try to, even out the Pope's authority a little bit, or maybe subdue the Pope's authority a bit. But this gets rejected by several popes in the 15th and 16th century. So the Conciliar Movement is largely a failure. And then there's the Renaissance papacy, which is where you have all these French invasions. You have the warrior pope, for example, who's like leading troops in battles and stuff like that. And that's just really not what popes were meant to do. Popes were meant to be spiritual figures, the person, the top of the highest ranks of the Roman Catholic Church. The popes weren't supposed to be engaging in political, secular type things. Okay, but that's indeed what they start doing during the Renaissance invasions of Italy, or the Italian states, at the time of the Renaissance by the French, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the Renaissance era is characterized by these popes kind of doing things that they shouldn't really be doing, and this again hurts their prestige. Another major idea that contributes as a cause to the causes of the Reformation is that you had a whole lot of corruption going on in the church at this time. Particularly, there's something happening called simony. And what simony is the sale of church offices. Imagine giving a position to people, a sensitive position, an important position that carries with it a whole lot of authority and power, right? And they're giving it to people not based on how good they are, not based on their merit, not based on their qualifications, but based on basically just auctioning off these positions to the highest bidder. Okay, so for example, and this is where I'm talking about the historical argument, right? I'm talking about a particular thing called simony here, all right? And this is a piece of evidence that I'm using to substantiate that there was corruption in the church. If I just say there was corruption in the church, we could come across somebody else who says, no, there wasn't. And then, now it's just my word against that other person's word, all right? If I start to say, well, what about the simony, right? How about the fact that for an example, in 1487, the Pope sold 24 offices to people, okay? Now I'm starting to provide evidence where it's like, whoa, okay, well, I didn't know that, right? And now I'm strengthening my argument, right, by supplying you with some specific information where it's like, well, okay, that's a pretty good That's a pretty good piece of evidence, right? And some of these reformers that we start to see come about, these Protestant reformers, they start saying like, this is unacceptable. We can't just be selling positions to people who have money, because people who have money want to increase their power, right? We should be giving the church positions to people who are qualified, even if they may not be the wealthiest people in Europe at this time. We want our top ranking officials within the church, bishops, cardinals, and other people like that. We want them to have qualifications. We want them to be spiritually, good, holy. We want them to be qualified for the positions that they're going to be serving in, not just give positions to wealthy people. And stuff like this still happens today. Stuff like this still happens today at the upper echelons of government. People who are wealthy are able to get into office and serve in office and stuff like that because they have a whole lot of wealth to go campaign and do other things like that. And it doesn't always pan out that way, but certainly you have people in Congress and people in the presidency and stuff like that who may not come from super wealth, but for the vast majority of people who are serving in the upper echelons of our government, they're quite wealthy, right? And there is a bit of an advantage for people who have money, and this was very true in the days of the Roman Catholic Church as well. Pluralism is another example of corruption in the church, where we saw people holding more than one position at a time and getting paid for those positions, right? So imagine, for me, I'm a full-time teacher, and I teach 4 different subjects, okay, for a total of 5 classes here at the high school. But let's say that I was saying that I held 4 different titles at the high school, right? And I should collect 4 separate salaries for each of those titles, even though somebody else may be working just as many hours as me, but only hold 1 title, and yet I'm getting 4 times the pay. Well, that's not fair, right? Then think about that word plural. All plural is multiple of something, right? So goose is singular, geese is multiple, okay? And so pluralism is holding multiple positions at a time. Absenteeism is another thing that was happening at this time. Imagine, for the sake of argument, that here I am at the high school holding my position as a teacher, but I'm not even doing anything. Let's say I'm just like off on vacation somewhere and I'm not even like really teaching my classes or whatever, but yet I'm still collecting a salary and I'm kind of just phoning it in every day. All right. People were doing that in the church. You had people who were officials who held official positions, but they're not even participating in their church offices, benefices. Okay. They're not even really performing any work, but they're nonetheless still receiving all of the privileges and payments that go along as though they were doing the work. And that's another form of corruption that's going on at this time. So again, I'm providing you with nice specific pieces of evidence to substantiate my argument that the church was becoming kind of this corrupt structure of power. Now, another thing that starts to happen after the Black Plague hits in the mid 1300s, what we see is that the church starts to expand this idea of something called purgatory. Okay, purgatory. Blanked on the word for a second there. So purgatory was this concept that prior to the Black Death, it was not really focused on that much. But the reason that the Black Death plays a role in this next thing that I'm going to be talking about, which is called the Sale of Indulgences, is because the Black Death resulted in people dying in, precipitously large numbers. And in the Catholic Church, you have these things called the 7 sacraments. And the last of those sacraments is supposed to be your last rites, where a priest comes in, you're on your deathbed, your priest, will give you whatever blessing or what, and then forgive you of your sins and okay? Well, because people were dying so quickly from the plague, maybe they didn't get a chance to have their last rites read to them by their local pastor or parish priest. And so what ended up happening was that the church starts expanding this idea of purgatory. Now, what is purgatory? Purgatory is this kind of like, think of it almost like a waiting room at the doctor's office or the dentist's office or wherever. It's kind of like at the doctor's office, let's say you're going there because you have something wrong. Maybe you're injured or whatever. It doesn't really matter what it is. Okay, and you don't really know the result yet because you haven't seen the doctor yet. So maybe you got a broken arm, maybe you don't have a broken arm. But you don't know yet. You're sitting in the waiting room, still waiting to see the doctor. Okay, purgatory is kind of like that, except for with heaven and hell. Okay, it's like the waiting room before it's been determined where what your fate will be in the afterlife. Okay, and so what the church started doing was they started selling these things called indulgences. Okay, now if you think about what an indulgence is, okay, if you indulge in something, what you're doing is you're kind of like, maybe I indulge by having a giant piece of pie after a big meal or something like that, and I'm like, maybe I know I shouldn't because I'm trying to watch my weight or whatever, but I just wolf down that cake or pie or whatever. Okay, idea being here that if you were wealthy in the Renaissance, people could pay money to the church to absolve them of their sins, or if you had a loved one who passed away really unexpectedly, you could pay the church so that their sins would be absolved more quickly. Now, I don't need to tell you that this probably sounds like a pretty corrupt practice. After all, we are dealing in something here where the church says, like, you can pay us, and by paying us, we'll make sure that that your loved one doesn't have to stay in the waiting room to heaven or hell for however many years. Could be hundreds of years, could be 1,000 years. We didn't know. Okay, so the church starts expanding this idea of purgatory so that they can say, well, we don't know what the fate of your loved one is yet. Okay, but if you pay us some money, probably they'll be able to purge their sins and ascend to heaven. Okay, otherwise, maybe they'll have to stay in purgatory for an awfully long time, where the determination of their soul is in limbo. All right, one of the priests who became really well known for the Sale of Indulgences was this priest in Germany, what is now modern day Saxony, in Saxony, what is now modern day Germany. Okay, named Johann Tetzel. Okay, Johann Tetzel and his Sale of Indulgences really infuriated this lower level monk that lived in the same region named Martin Luther, who you probably have heard of before. Okay, and then what is the church doing with this money but using the money to build massive cathedrals, to commission some of those famous pieces of art that we were looking at by artists like Michelangelo and stuff like that, who commanded a very high price for their work. And so the church is using those monies to increase the amount of spending that they can do on the building of cathedrals like St. Peter's Basilica and stuff like that. And Martin Luther says, I don't really think that this is in the Bible anywhere. I'm kind of sure that it's not, because I've read the thing cover to cover many, many times, front and back, and I don't see anything about indulgences in there. This sounds like corruption to me. Another thing is something called nepotism. Nepotism is where high-ranking church officials, popes, and others would start placing family members into positions. And I think there was a question about this on the last reading guide. And there were two popes at the time, Leo X and Clement VII, who were both sons of Florentine Medici rulers who got placed into these positions because they were connected by way of blood relatives to people in high-ranking offices. Also, the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, was very nepotistic. All right, and then Pope Paul III made two of his own grandsons cardinals. Now, if you think about this, his grandsons were probably only in their teens, maybe early 20s or something like that. He makes them cardinals. Cardinals are usually very, very old members of the church who've been serving in some capacity in the church for a long, long, long time. So if you're putting people who are related to you into positions of power, it's seen as kind of a little bit, kind of almost like the other thing where we were talking about with simony, where people were able to pay, and in spite of the fact that maybe, on terms of just purely their merit or their accomplishments or, their qualifications, those aren't important. They're just being placed in these positions because they know someone in power. And indeed, this still happens today. Like, even our own president has placed his daughter in a position, I forget what her exact position is within the administration, but and then his son-in-law and stuff like that. And so we see these sorts of things happen where people are favored just because they happen to be related to somebody who is in power. Okay, corruption in the Catholic Church. Continuing on to the next slide, slide 5 I'm on now. We see a moral decline in the papacy here with Alexander VI in particular. Now, Alexander VI served as Pope for about 11 years, from 1492 to 1503. But as he was even in office as the Pope, and keep in mind, the Pope is supposed to be the highest spiritual authority, the closest spiritual authority that you get to God. Okay, the Pope is supposed to really more or less be the voice of God himself. All right, you know, the mediary between God and the worshipers. Okay, and look at some of the things he's doing. He has numerous affairs while he's Pope. Okay, meaning, you know, popes aren't even supposed to get married, much less have affairs. All right, and so this guy is, you know, is doing things that popes are supposed to be celibate. They're not supposed to be engaging in, you know, whatever pleasures of the body or what. Okay, they're not supposed to be having children. They're not supposed to be getting married, and they're certainly not supposed to be having, you know, extramarital affairs or whatever. And it just doesn't look good. It just looks bad. But he's not the only one. 20%, about a fifth of all priests in the Diocese of Trent kept concubines during the 16th century. And again, here I'm providing more evidence. Concubines are basically a form of sex slave, okay, where they would keep these women, and these women, you know, didn't have many other options, particularly in this time. 30% of the land in Europe was under church control or ownership. And remember, land is tantamount to wealth at this time. So, you know, they're not only very wealthy, they're extremely wealthy, bordering on greedy. And again, the church wasn't supposed to be about material wealth acquisition. It wasn't supposed to be about commissioning famous artists. It wasn't supposed to be about building these grandiose cathedrals that are hugely, hugely expensive and beautiful. I mean, don't get me wrong, absolutely gorgeous, but they're not supposed to be engaging in pleasures of the earth. And so these kinds of things contribute to a moral decline in the papacy that particularly some of these reformers who we're about to start talking about, they objected to, because they said this is somehow taking away from what the church is supposed to be about, as according to the original teachings of Jesus and the writings of the Bible. And then you just have straight up pure clerical ignorance. In other words, you have a lot of people serving in these capacities as parish priests, or even in the higher ranking clerical positions within the church. You have these guys who are essentially illiterate, you know, as many people in the late Middle Ages and in the early Renaissance era were, that couldn't even read the Latin that was written in the Bible. Okay, they didn't know how to pronounce it correctly. They didn't know what most of the words meant. They're doing the sermons and the mass and the liturgy and all of that in a language that they really don't understand. And so, you know, that doesn't look good either, because basically it means that you're kind of making it up as you go along a little bit. You know, if somebody comes to you for spiritual guidance, as people used to do back in those days, whether it's for confessionals or other things, you know, the church was basically taking a very, very elastic view of the Bible. And, you know, that was a problem, because it meant that maybe things started happening in the church that there was no real scripture for in the Bible. And some of these clerics, some of these religious figures started abusing their power. And we saw, for example, trading of sexual favors for the absolution of sins during confession. And that's just unacceptable behavior, right? There ended up being a lot of kind of scandalous behavior that occurred in the church. And I wish that I could tell you that it just magically went away after the Protestant Reformation, but it really didn't. And even in recent times, I mean, you know, there's been all sorts of news stories from the past 10 years about, you know, sexual abuse and other things like that in the church, as a product of people being able to abuse their position of power within this religious structure. And it's just not good, right? It doesn't look good. And people start to question, like, you know, this needs to not be happening, right? So this is all of the above are reasons for why the Protestant Reformation really happens at all is because once people start to become aware, particularly in a time where more and more people start to become literate and to be able to read and to be able to understand what is and what is not said in the Bible, people start really questioning, like, should the church be doing some of these things? Now, when probably the most famous of these guys, of course, was Martin Luther, but Martin Luther didn't just come out of thin air. And so as we move on to slide 6 here on the PowerPoint, we have to look at some people, predecessors, people who came before Martin Luther, who influenced Martin Luther long before he was even born, okay? Because he certainly wasn't the first person to start questioning, maybe the church is doing some things here that we need to take a look at and probably correct, okay? And the first guy that we're going to look at here, critics of the church, is what we're talking about now, is another cause of the Reformation, is that over the course of a couple of centuries leading up to the Protestant Reformation, which we say kicks off in about the year 1517, there were these guys, one of them being this guy in the background here. His name is John Wycliffe. Okay, now he lived from 1329 to 1384 in England. And one of the things that you're going to find out about John Wycliffe and some of these other guys that we talk about is that they lived a very long way away from Rome. Okay, they didn't live in Rome. They weren't, kind of like one of those things, the closer you fly to the sun, the famous story of Icarus, the old Greek story, where Icarus flew too close to the sun, he had wings made of wax, and they melted and he fell. Okay, the closer you are to the Roman Catholic Church, the less likely you are to be able to get away with questioning the church. So what you're going to notice about a lot of these guys is that these guys are quite a distance away from the church, which gave them a little bit more leniency to be able to get away with criticizing the church, because had they lived closer to the center of the Roman Catholic Church down in Rome, which is in Italy, okay, they probably wouldn't have gotten away with questioning the church's authority to the extent that they did in their time. Now, they don't break away from the church. To be clear, they are still operating from within the church. They all consider themselves very Catholic, but some of these guys probably thought of themselves as more Catholic than others, particularly some of the higher ranking members of the church who were engaging in some of these corrupt behaviors. All right, so John Wycliffe is from England, which at that time is a really, really long way away from Rome, particularly because it's an island. So it would have been difficult for anyone from Rome to be able to get to him, much less maybe even hear what he was writing in the 1300s in England. But John Wycliffe started stating, that the Bible should be the sole authority of people's communion with God, that people shouldn't be trusting what higher ranking members of the church have to say just because they're higher ranking members of the church, that a personal relationship with God was what was most important. All right. Now, this very much foreshadowed what Martin Luther would start to teach in the 16th century, the 1500s, nearly 200 years later. All right. So he stressed this personal communion with God. He also started to diminish the importance of the sacraments, and that's in part due to some of the things that I was talking about, which is that a person doesn't necessarily need to perform all of these sacraments in order to get into heaven, that the sacraments were good rules to live by, but aren't the most important part of the faith. He also started to translate the Bible into English. Now, keep in mind that most people at this time are still very much illiterate. They cannot read, but they're even going to be less likely to be able to read if they're trying to learn a language to read and write that no one speaks anymore, which is Latin. So the Bible, there was quite an educational gap for people to have to bridge in order to be able to understand the words written down in the Bible, which was only printed in Latin. All right. So when you translate it into the local vernacular, the local languages that people speak, whether that be English or French or German or whatever it is, okay, people are going to be more likely to be able to access the information in there once they start to learn how to read, which people start to learn how to read a lot more after the introduction of something called the Gutenberg printing press, or a printing press with movable type, which gets invented in the 1400s in Germany, what is now modern day Germany, the Holy Roman Empire. And once one gets invented, more of them start popping up all over the place. All right. So these materials start to become more accessible to your everyday common worshipers. All right. And so John Wycliffe ended up developing a number of followers known as Lollards, and they continued his ideas all the way up into the 16th century after the start of the Protestant Reformation, when Martin Luther formally breaks away from the church. As we move on to slide 7, talking about another major critic of the church from a completely different region over in what is now the Czech Republic. Okay, the Czech Republic didn't exist at that time. I mean, the land was there, obviously, but it wasn't called the Czech Republic. It was known as Bohemia. And so the region that this guy came from was kind of, Central Eastern Europe in what is now like the Czech Republic. And this guy's name was Jan Hus. Jan Hus lived from 1369 all the way up until 1415. Jan Hus was a priest, and he had very similar ideas to John Wycliffe, who came just before him, but they were kind of contemporaries of one another. And he was a religious leader in Bohemia who led kind of a nationalist movement, actually, in Bohemia, where a number of these worshipers would come to see, from miles and miles around, would come to see Jan Hus's sermons, because Jan Hus was very fiery. He was a very, very talented orator, very talented public speaker. And he would give these sermons where he criticized the upper echelons of the Roman Catholic Church for engaging in all of the kinds of sins that they did. And he very much viewed himself, even though he was a higher ranking member than his worshipers were, he very much considered himself one of the common people, and gave these speeches that were critical and said, I'm not perfect, and I sin because I am human, just like you guys sin and you're human. But if we look at the upper echelons of the church, he started calling out the hypocrisy, okay, kind of the conflicting statements of the church, who on one hand will reprimand you if you're sinful, but on the other hand get away with it themselves when they're at the upper echelons of the church. And this really resonated with a lot of his worshipers, because they said, hey, this guy makes some really good points here. And he started to become very popular, and he started to become a threat, because his teachings do make it back to the Roman Catholic Church. And once they find out that there's somebody out there who's criticizing them and questioning their authority, what they do is they ultimately end up deeming him a heretic, and he is burned at the stake for his views. All right. So the church has a vested interest in silencing the people that are questioning the church, right? Because they don't want to see that uniformity break up. They don't want to see divisions happen within the church. They're trying to keep a stranglehold on all of the worshipers across Christendom, all of Christian Europe. There was something called the Imitation of Christ, which was a piece written around 1418 by a guy named Thomas à Kempis. And this piece started to circulate, and it encouraged your everyday common Christians to live simply, okay, to make your religious views a personal experience, to develop a personal relationship with God. Again, very, very similar to some of these reformers' views that say it's not about what the church thinks about you, it's what your personal communion is with God, and if you're living a true Christian life in God's eyes, okay, because God sees everything, and whether or not the church sees things is another matter. Okay, so this is another thing that encourages people to develop that personal communion. The next major figure that we get to here is a guy by the name of Erasmus of Rotterdam. And it's often said of Erasmus that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. What do we mean by that? The idea being that when Erasmus started teaching and questioning the church and publishing these pieces that started to become very highly accessible to the public, all right, that his teachings ultimately were the thing that inspired Luther to be the one to break away from the church. So once again, why is Luther the one that breaks away from the church? Well, in some sense, things had kind of by the time that he exists, he's kind of in there at the right time, okay? Because if it wasn't Luther, it likely would have been somebody else who broke away from the church formally. Now, Erasmus does not break away from the church. Okay, Erasmus stays from, inside the Catholic framework to try to reform things from within. His view on things was that, if we see people break away from the church and the church starts to fragment into smaller subsidiary religious groups, okay, Protestant faiths, that this would cause untold bloodshed in Europe. And he was actually quite right about that, because one of the next things that happens after the Protestant Reformation that we're going to be focusing on later on in this unit is the religious wars that follow, because eventually you start to have these Christians fighting against other Christians based on whether they're Catholic or they're Protestant. Not to mention, you have some people who are a little bit more conservative Protestants and people who are much more radical Protestants. And even they don't get along necessarily with one another at all times. So this was a concern that Erasmus had from the very get-go. And later on in his life, he and Luther very much split ways, because Luther is disappointed that Erasmus refuses to break away from the church, even though they shared a lot of the similar views on the wrongdoings of the Catholic Church. Nonetheless, Erasmus of Rotterdam is best known for the piece that he wrote known as In Praise of Folly. And we're going to be taking a look, and one of your assignments for today is going to be to hippo that document, and we are going to read some of it together today before we get done with the class for the day. But in praise of folly, folly is a word that means foolishness. Okay, in praise of foolishness. Sorry, my lights are turning off, so I got to turn them on. If I stand too still, my lights automatically turn off. So, okay. So he's born in the foolishness, in praise of foolishness. Now, when we think about the title of this book, why would anyone praise foolishness? Usually people are ridiculed for being foolish. Why would Erasmus write a book saying in praise of folly, in praise of foolishness? Well, to be honest with you, this title of this book is rather satirical. It's almost kind of sarcastic in nature. He's saying in praise of foolishness in a way that is saying, like, I am good. Think of Erasmus. Here's the best way I can describe Erasmus. If you've ever been on internet forums, whether it's on Reddit or whatever other forums there are on the internet, you always find, even in the comments section on YouTube and stuff like that, you find trolls, right? People who are just kind of like unhappy people who just get a rise out of flaming folks on the internet, all right? And that's essentially kind of what Erasmus was. He's like the ultimate flamer of his time. He just flames people for ultimate troll of his time. He's like trolling people, right, for the practices that they engage in the time that he lived in. And so we're going to take a look at that piece, and you're going to see how kind of sarcastic and how satirical he is in his writings, and he's very inflammatory, right? His writings definitely were meant to like upset people, but they also really resonated with the common person in Europe at the time. Born in the Dutch city of Rotterdam in what is now modern day Amsterdam, okay? He lived both in France and England for most of his life, and he was very critical of the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church and the hypocrisy of the clergy, who would say one thing but do another. And he said that the church really needed a lot of moral reforms if it was to return to the degree of holiness, to the degree of sanctity that the church once symbolized. Okay, some argue that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched, because again, Luther was heavily influenced by Erasmus's teachings. Erasmus is similar to other reformers, Jan Hus and John Wycliffe before him, was very much of the opinion that the church shouldn't be using the Bible in a format that wasn't literal, right? The Roman Catholic Church had gotten very used to saying, well, this parable of the Bible says this, and here's kind of what that means, and here's how maybe we can connect it to your life over here. That had a very elastic view of the Bible, right? But Erasmus says, the Bible is written and the words are crystal clear on the page, and we should be following the Bible in a very literal way. And that brings me to a very important point that I want to make about the Protestant Reformation. Usually when we talk about that word reform, we're talking about it in the context of progress, right? Moving things forward, changing things for the better, to accommodate the situation in Europe or wherever we are at the time. Okay, so we think of progress as forward moving. When we talk about the Protestant Reformation, though, this kind of reformation is very much a backwards moving reform. They're trying to, if you will, make the church great again. Okay, they're trying to bring the church back to the way that it used to be. all right? They're trying to reinstate the much more conservative, the much more strict, the much more difficult existence of a Christian, all right? They were trying to make the interpretation of the Bible very, very literal, which, there's basically two perspectives on that. The one perspective is that the church had gotten out of hand and they were, very corrupt, okay? And that interpreting the Bible would lead to this reduction of corruption within the church. The other viewpoint is that, the Bible was written, by this point already, about 1,200 years earlier, all right? And the Bible had been written by several people under different contexts over the course of several centuries back in the ancient times, and that the times weren't ancient anymore, and that the Bible, some of the things written in the Bible were written under a very strict eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth style governance, where society was extremely ruthless. And not to say that society wasn't ruthless back in the Renaissance, because it certainly was, but times had changed, and that the Bible, if we were to interpret it literally, the extent to which that really applied to people's everyday lives 1,500 years after the Bible was written may not be as valid or something. So there's kind of two different views on it, but nonetheless, these Protestant reformers are really trying to bring the church back to this older style of Christianity that was much more, strict in a lot of ways. Okay, much stricter. The true religion, okay, was a matter of inward sincerity and your pious devotion to God and living a life that is, rejecting sin. And so that's really another, again, that personal relationship development and living a truly holy life, not just a holy life on the surface that your local priest says is good. Okay. So let's talk about some other causes of the Reformation here. Another one being the impact that Renaissance humanism had on things. Now, when we think about Italian humanism, civic humanism, it was very secular in nature. It was this idea of being well educated in a lot of areas outside of just religion, but music and poetry and letters and other things, okay? And being skilled in a number of different things. It's interesting because Northern humanism kind of takes on a different shape. Northern humanism, contrary to Italian humanism, which was very secular in many ways, going back and talking about those guys that we learned about, Petrarch, Pico della Mirandola, and so on, Boccaccio. All of those guys were very secular humanists in the sense that even though humanism is fundamentally religious in the sense that, they believe that humans are God's greatest creation and stuff like that. Remember Petrarch would quote, ancient Latin or ancient Roman texts and stories and stuff like that. And that's clearly not stories from the Bible. On the other hand, in Northern Europe, Northern humanism takes on a very, very religious connotation. And they're using religious texts to criticize the church and say, hey, there's some things going on with the church that shouldn't be going on. And they're questioning the validity of the Catholic Bible that had been used. And so this textual criticism comes in the form of translations so that they start making the Bible more accessible to people. And as you can understand, the Roman Catholic Church doesn't really want to see that happen. They want to keep the Bible in Latin because they have a vested interest in keeping the society uninformed. They don't want people to be able to become informed about the Bible. They want to hold the information themselves so that they can dictate to people what's in the Bible. And this is something that Northern Christian humanists start to reject, and they start to make the content of the Bible more accessible to folks. The Italian Renaissance was sometimes marked by a de-emphasis on religion while emphasizing secularism and individualism amongst the high church leaders. And we see, the church using monies for commissioning famous art pieces and frescoes and so on and so forth, as well as the construction of new cathedrals and that sort of thing. And this drew a lot of criticism as well from these Northern humanists who oppose the moral decline in the church and the opulence, the utter beauty, the grandiosity of all of these buildings and the glory and the wealth that was attributed with that, because they said, real worshipers aren't about getting wealthy. They're not about exercising life. Okay, so Northern humanism is very, very religious in its proliferation. And then a couple other guys that we should probably know about: the impact of Renaissance humanism from Ulrich Zwingli, who was a Swiss reformer. He was from Switzerland, and he was trained as a humanist as well, and saw a number of flaws within the Roman Catholic Church. And as a preacher, he even used some of Erasmus's work, but he and others, basically started teaching these ideas of a personal communion with God, and using the written words, the literal translations of the Bible in order to live a more spiritual life, and used his friend Erasmus's edition of the Greek New Testament, which was translated into local vernacular as well. John Calvin ended up being even more influential than Martin Luther in terms of the scope of how many people became Calvinists of different kinds: French Calvinists, English Calvinists, Scottish Calvinists, Dutch Calvinists. There's a lot of different Calvinists around Europe that start to emerge after Martin Luther. And John Calvin was also heavily influenced by humanism, but again, more that northern religious humanism, particularly the writings of Erasmus. Now, after Martin Luther's Reformation, humanists started to turn many monasteries into schools and to start training people in local vernacular of these Protestant faiths. And this was assisted by the Gutenberg printing press with movable type that I talked about before, which now starts to print things across Europe that are accessible to the people because they're written in these local languages. And so we see a growing segment of a previously illiterate portion of the population who are now educated and willing to criticize the church. Okay, and before we get to Martin Luther, now I'm going to go back and we're going to just take a quick look at this Erasmus in Praise of Folly document, and this will bring us to the end of our class. But let me pull that up really quickly. Now, if you go onto Canvas and you go to the Files section and you go to Primary Resources folder, you will see a new document in there called Erasmus Excerpts, and we're going to be taking a look at that. And I'm just going to read for you the first part here as you go back into Canvas and pull that up and open it up on your screen. These excerpts of the writings of Erasmus are from that piece that I told you about earlier in Praise of Folly. This is the guy who was trolling everybody. Okay, so Desiderius Erasmus, this is just the introductory part, was born in Rotterdam in Holland, which was a province of the Netherlands at the time. Okay, I think I said Amsterdam earlier. I don't know why, but I meant the Netherlands. Amsterdam's the capital of Holland and indeed the capital of the Netherlands. Okay, Desiderius was born in Rotterdam in Holland in 1466. He was ordained a priest in 1492, which is the same year that Columbus set sail across the ocean. But he left the monastic life, the monastery life, 2 years later. And then he went to Paris to study theology, which is religious learnings, in 1495, and then to England in 1499, where he became a very close friend of the religious humanist Thomas More, who wrote a famous piece called Utopia. He also published the Incurdion Militis Christiani, which is, it's Latin, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that really badly, in 1501, which was an appeal for a return to the spirit of early Christianity. Again, that idea of the Protestant Reformation bringing people back to an earlier time. They're reforming it by trying to make the church more conservative, bring it back to the old ways of doing things, a much more strict, a much more simple form of Christianity. With its emphasis on mutual love, sharing, and the rejection of the pursuit of material, earthly riches. In 1509, Erasmus wrote In Praise of Folly, which proved one of the most widely published and influential of all Renaissance humanist books. The book deals with all manner of secular and religious follies, foolishness, okay, both types of which he mercilessly mocked. Okay, so again, he's like a troll. He's mocking what people value in society at this time. And in 1516, Erasmus published another hugely influential book, a new edition of the New Testament based on his translation from the original Greek, and that was the one that Zwingli used. It was this edition that would serve as the basis for the King James Version of the Bible, which was developed in 1605 under King James I in England. Erasmus's sharp criticism of church practices was influential in the early development of Martin Luther's thought. During the early years of the Reformation, it was written that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. As Luther developed his theology, which is Lutheranism, however, he grew disenchanted with what he saw as Erasmus's equivocation over church failings. Equivocation is like flip-flopping, okay? It's like backing away or not, maybe, not being as fervent on an opinion as you could be, kind of like being ambivalent, sitting on the fence. That's what equivocating is, okay? Erasmus would not fundamentally condemn or leave the Catholic Church, choosing to stay and work for reform from within. He warned that Luther's agitation would lead to mass bloodshed, meaning like religious warfare, a prophecy that proved all too true. Their relationship became the relationship between Luther and Erasmus became very bitter towards the end of their lives. Erasmus died in 1536. The below excerpts give a flavor for the range and character of his writings. So let's read some of these things that he's trolling people on in the 1500s here. So the first topic is on in praise of folly, or in praise of foolishness on war. So basically, praising the foolishness of war is this section here. Remember, this is written with a kind of a sarcastic tone. I often wonder what thing it is that drives men to such a degree of madness as to rush with so much pains, so much cost, so much risk to the destruction of one another. For what are we doing all our lives but making war? The brute beasts do not all engage in war, but only some wild kinds. And those do not fight amongst themselves, but with animals of different species. They fight too with their natural arms, meaning like their claws and their teeth and stuff, not like us with machines, upon which we spend an ingenuity worthy of devils. Okay, so he's talking about all of these, military devices that people have developed, catapults and ballistas and, cannons and bows and arrows and crossbows and all of these other things. He's like, we spend a fortune developing all these new weapons to destroy one another. How foolish is that? Consider, too, how many crimes are committed under the pretext of war, when, as they say, in the midst of arms, laws are silenced. Okay, we have a different phrase for that these days. All is fair in love and war, meaning that, like, when wars happen, people will utterly destroy one another and throw all the rules out, and whatever happens, happens, okay? Whatever's fair is fair. If both sides can do it, both sides will engage in it. So much risk to the, how many thefts, how many acts of sacrilege, how many rapes, how many other abuses, which one is ashamed to even name, and blood of so many thousand men, and this moral contagion cannot but last for many years, even when the war itself is over. What kingdom can you set against the lives and blood of so many thousand men? Of so many thousand men. And it is followed by such a train of calamities that there is good reason in the fiction of poets that war comes to us from hell and is sent by the Furies. So he's saying at the end of the day, war is really the work of the devil for humans to destroy one another over these, pithy, trivialities of our existence on this earth. But you will say, but will you say, suppose there is a real dispute to whom some sovereignty belongs? It is not a question concerning a nation's welfare, but only whether it is bound to call this or that personage its sovereign. And if you look a little closely, you will find that it is generally the private interests of those in power that give occasion to war. The private interests of those in power that give occasion to war. That is, personal greed, personal seeking out of power is what ultimately results in places going to war at the cost of all of these thousands of men who have nothing to benefit from it. So he's calling out people for waging war for their own personal gain. Okay, and again, this is like the utmost. This is fiery work right here, right? This is meant to stoke some real anger in people, and it resonates with people who feel like, you know what, hey, what do I get out of it, right? Another thing he talks about is hunters. Now, just briefly talking about hunters at this time, hunting was something that was only able to be done by nobles, okay? Because when you go out on land and into forests or whatever, you're on someone's land in Europe. Somebody lays claim to that land, and it's going to be a noble who's entitled to that land. So they viewed whatever was on that land as theirs, including the animals. So if you were just a common peasant and you were hunting on lands that were not yours, and you started killing animals, you could get in some serious trouble for that, for poaching, all right? But nobles, when they would go out hunting, it's a little different than today, all right? They would hunt, but they would go on horseback. They would bring bows and arrows and dogs with them and bugles, and it was quite an affair, and a lot of nobles really loved engaging in hunting as a privileged activity that nobles were able to do. All right, so let's read what he says about this. Among these to be ranked as the greatest of fools, such as take an immoderate delight in hunting, and think no music comparable to the sounding of horns and the yelping of beagles. And were they to require medication, would no doubt think the most supreme virtues to be in the dried poop on a dog's tail. Meaning, like, look at these fools out there doing their hunting and their little ceremonies, and these nobles who think that they're so special, so important when they engage in these hunting activities. When they have run down their game, meaning the animals they're hunting, what strange pleasure they take in cutting of it up. Cows and sheep may be chopped by common butchers, but what is killed in hunting must be dismembered, cut into pieces by none other than the rank of a gentleman, a noble, who shall fall devoutly on his knees, and drawing out a fancy sword after several ceremonies, shall dissect all the parts as artificially as the best skilled anatomist, while all that stand round shall watch this intently, and that he can but dip his finger and taste of the blood, shall think his own blood improved by it. Okay, so he's saying, look at how dumb hunting is, look at how stupid this practice is, and trolling the nobles for their hunting practices. Of philosophers, the foolishness of philosophers. He says, next to these come the philosophers in their long beards and short cloaks, who esteem themselves the only possessors of wisdom, and they look upon the rest of mankind as the dirt and rubbish of creation. Yet these men's happiness is only a frantic craziness of brain. They build castles in the air, and infinite words in a vacuum. They will give you to a hair's breadth the dimensions of the sun, moon, and stars as easily as they would do that of a flagon or a saucepan. They'll give punctual account of the creation of thunder, of the origin of winds, of the nature of eclipses, and all the other abstruse difficulties in physics without the least demur or hesitation. Meaning he's saying, look at how smart these guys think they are. Look, they're so knowledgeable about all this lofty stuff that they claim no one else understands, as if they had been admitted into the inner council of creation. Alas, nature but does laugh at all their puny conjectures, for they never yet made one worthwhile discovery on which they are all unanimously agreed in each point of the smallest moment. So you have this huge group of philosophers out there who talk and talk and talk, and they think of themselves as being so smart, yet when they talk to one another, they can sit there and argue until the cows come home, because they'll never agree on everything, and they're just fools for it. Okay, so again, he's criticizing people here. So this is, when you think about this in the context of the Protestant Reformation, he's really calling out a lot of these practices that people seem to just kind of accept as being like, well, that's the way that it is. And he's saying, look at how dumb it is. Okay, look at how foolish these people are. If we were really smart, what we would do is we'd bring the church back to the way that it was, so that people gave up all of these petty differences and these petty ceremonies and practices that make them seem like fools, so that we can restore some credibility to the church and have a congregation of worshipers who were holy and had spiritual communion with God. Okay, so that's kind of the nature of this text here. And so with that, I am going to draw to a close today's lecture. There is an assignment of the 20 questions from the reading guide, as well as the pages for the reading are in that assignment. And I have also posted the Hippo assignment associated with some of what we just read right here. And it does go down a little bit further onto another page, and you can read more of kind of his trolling of all of these different all of these different people. You know, he goes on and on, of courts, of popes, cardinals, and bishops. This is inflammatory stuff for his day. And remember, it gets really, really widely publicized. But he is a Catholic, and he's an educated man, and he's a man who served for a period of time as a monk and stuff like that. He's educated in theology, so he is something of a an authority, an intellectual authority, and also a religious authority at this time. So, but he refuses himself to break away from the church, insisting that changes could come from within. So, before we leave for today, I will just ask you a quick question. Let's see here. Let's go with a new question. Let's go with maybe I already asked this one. I don't know if I already asked this one. What is your favorite movie of all time? Favorite movie of all time. Okay. Could watch it again and again. Maybe already have watched it umpteen million times. And I might have asked this one before, but you could probably quote every line in the movie. Back to the Future, Karate Kid, 80s movies, love it. Those are ones I know. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, ooh. Rambo, Interstellar, I love Interstellar. That's a good one. Up, Gladiator, great movie, love Gladiator. Coco, Greatest Showman, Star Wars: A New Hope, can't go wrong there. Coraline, love. Rosie. That's great. Home Alone. Home Alone's a great movie. Christmas movie. That's like one of my favorite Christmas movies. Cool. Very good. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of today's lecture. Please do go on and get those assignments done by Friday and submit them. And we'll see you back here. Martian. Ooh, yeah, that's a good one. I like that one. Matt Damon. Okay, very good. Get those assignments done, folks, and thank you so much. Make good decisions and have a wonderful rest of the day.